For 40 years, I've kept files that prove Bigfoot families exist, and the reason the FBI has been hiding them isn't to protect national security. It's to protect the people who've been hunting them to extinction since before I was born. My name is Robert Callahan. I'm 78 years old, and I spent 35 years as a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Most of that time was dedicated to something the public has never heard about, something that doesn't appear in any official FBI publication or congressional testimony. We call it the Yuba Protocol, Unidentified Biological Anomalies. And what I'm about to tell you is the truth about what we've known, what we've documented, and what we've been ordered to keep silent about since 1962. September of 1978. I was 28 years old, fresh out of the FBI Academy at Quantico, still wearing suits that felt too stiff and carrying a badge that seemed heavier than it should. I'd graduated with honors, background in zoology from UC Davis before I decided law enforcement was my calling, thought I'd be chasing bank robbers, building cases against organized crime, doing real investigative work. Instead, I got assigned to the Seattle field office, which seemed like punishment for graduating top of my class. Seattle in those days was quiet. Logging disputes, occasional white-collar crime, nothing that would make a career. My supervisor was a man named Marcus Webb. He was 53 years old, had been with the Bureau for 25 years, and had the kind of weathered face that comes from seeing things you can't talk about at dinner parties. On my first day, he shook my hand with a grip that felt like a test and told me the Pacific Northwest was different from what they taught us at Quantico. Out here, we deal with things that don't fit the manual, Webb said, pouring coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since the Kennedy administration. You'll learn that soon enough. I thought he was talking about jurisdictional issues with tribal lands, or maybe the environmental activism that was starting to heat up in the region. I was wrong. On my third day, Webb took me down to the basement archives. The Seattle field office occupied 4 floors of a federal building downtown, but the basement was where they kept the old files, the cases that weren't active but couldn't be destroyed. Rows of industrial shelving, cardboard boxes labeled with case numbers and dates going back to the 1940s. The air smelled like old paper and mildew. Webb led me past the main archive area to a corner I hadn't noticed during my orientation, a separate room with a steel door and a combination lock. "This is where we keep the special files," Webb said, working the combination. "Your security clearance covers it, but what you see here doesn't leave this building. Understand?" I nodded, curiosity overriding any nervousness. The room was smaller than I expected, maybe 12 by 12 feet, with a single filing cabinet against the far wall. 4 drawers, each labeled with letters instead of case numbers. UBA. Webb pulled open the top drawer. "Unidentified biological anomalies," he said. "We've been documenting them since 1962. You're going to be the junior agent on this protocol now. Your job is to maintain these files, coordinate with National Park Service and Forest Service when reports come in, and keep everything quiet." I looked into the drawer. Manila folders, dozens of them, each thick with documents. I pulled one out at random. The tab read, "Skamania County, Washington, August 1971. Inside were witness statements, photographs of massive footprints pressed into mud, plaster casts with measurements written in neat handwriting. 17 inches long, 8 inches wide at ball, 5 distinct toes. Estimated weight 650 to 700 pounds based on depth of impression." "What am I looking at?" I asked, though part of me already knew. Webb pulled out another file, this one from 1967. "Not the famous one everyone's heard about," he said. 3 weeks after that film footage in Northern California, we had another incident. Gunshots reported near Bluff Creek. Local sheriff called us in because he didn't know what else to do. Our agents found blood, non-human, non-bear, found tracks, found shell casings from a high-powered rifle. And the sheriff's report said something had been carried away, something big, leaving a blood trail into the forest that just stopped. Webb opened the file. Inside was a medical examiner's preliminary report, partially redacted. Blood sample analysis showed primate markers inconsistent with known North American species. Genetic testing recommended. Below that, stamped in red ink, "Do not pursue. Case closed by order." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This is real? These things are real? Webb looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Give it 6 months, kid. Monitor the reports, read through the files, coordinate when you need to. Then tell me if you still think this is a joke." I spent that evening in the archive room, reading file after file. Sightings going back 16 years. Footprints, hair samples, vocalizations recorded on tape. Witness statements from park rangers, hikers, hunters. Interdepartmental memos between FBI, National Park Service, U.S. Forest Service, even the CDC. Photographs that were too clear to be hoaxes, too detailed to be misidentifications. And through it all, a pattern of official disinterest, of evidence documented and then buried, of cases marked closed before they'd really been investigated. I drove home that night thinking about my zoology degree, about the classes on primate behavior and wildlife conservation. Nothing in my education had prepared me for this. Nothing in my FBI training had mentioned that we were tracking something that wasn't supposed to exist. I'd signed up to uphold the law, to investigate crimes, to protect people. What I hadn't realized was that sometimes protecting people meant protecting them from the truth. My first year managing the UBA files, I approached it like any other assignment. Professional detachment, systematic documentation, by-the-book procedures. I cataloged every report that came in, cross-referenced witness statements, filed photographs, and plaster casts with meticulous care. But somewhere around month 8, I started doing something the protocol didn't require. I started mapping the sightings. I bought topographical maps of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, spread them across my apartment floor, and marked every incident with colored pins. Red for visual sightings, blue for footprints only, yellow for vocalizations, green for property damage. Within 3 months, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The sightings weren't random. They clustered in specific regions: the Olympic Peninsula, the North Cascades, Mount Hood, Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. And within those regions, the report showed seasonal movement, migration routes between high-elevation summer territories and lower-elevation winter grounds. I started noticing something else in the reports. Family units. Not lone creatures wandering the woods, but groups. An adult with 2 juveniles spotted near Lake Chelan. A pair seen together repeatedly in the same area over multiple years. Small footprints alongside large ones. The behaviors described weren't those of animals. They were social structures, kinship groups, deliberate communication between individuals. I brought my findings to Webb in the spring of 1980, laid out the maps on his desk, showed him the clusters, the patterns, the evidence of organized behavior. He studied them for a long time, his weathered face unreadable. Then he looked up at me with something that might have been approval or might have been sadness. "We've got a report from Lake Quinault," he said. "Ranger Station got broken into last night. Food storage compromised. They want someone to take a look. You and I are going." We drove out that afternoon, 3 hours northwest to the Olympic Peninsula, The ranger station sat at the edge of the Kino rainforest, surrounded by Sitka spruce and western hemlock so thick the canopy blocked out most of the daylight. The ranger who'd called it in was a man named Peterson, maybe 50 years old, who'd worked that territory for 23 years. "It's not a bear," Peterson said immediately, leading us to the damaged cabin. "I know bear damage. This is something else." He was right. The door hadn't been clawed or chewed. It had been pulled off its hinges with brute force. Inside, the food storage had been methodically searched, items removed and examined, not just scattered. And in the soft earth around the structure, the tracks were unmistakable. 17 inches, humanoid shape, 5 toes, no claws. I spent 2 hours documenting everything. Photographs from multiple angles, measurements recorded in my field notebook, plaster casts made of the 3 clearest prints. Webb watched me work, saying nothing, just observing. When I found the smaller prints, maybe 12 inches long, following the same path as the larger ones, I felt something shift in my chest. A parent and child, a family looking for food. "We're camping here tonight," Webb said when I finished. "Bring your sleeping bag from the car." We set up maybe 100 yards from the cabin, near a creek where the sound of running water would cover our voices if we needed to talk. Peterson brought us coffee and sandwiches, then left us alone as the sun set behind the mountains. The forest grew dark in that way only old-growth forests can, where the tree cover is so dense that twilight becomes night in minutes. Around 11 p.m., I heard it. A vocalization from somewhere deeper in the forest, maybe half a mile away. Low and resonant, but structured. Not a howl, not a growl. It rose and fell in patterns that sounded almost like language. Then another voice answered from a different direction. Higher pitched, shorter bursts of sound. "They're communicating," I whispered to Webb. He nodded in the darkness. "Now you understand." We listened for another 20 minutes. The sounds moved, suggesting the speakers were walking, traveling through their territory. At one point, they came close enough that I heard branches breaking, heavy footfalls on the forest floor. My hand went instinctively to my service weapon, but Webb put his hand on my arm. "They know we're here," he said quietly. "They're deciding if we're a threat." The sounds moved away after that, fading into the distance until there was nothing but the creek and the wind in the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about those smaller footprints, about vocalizations that carried meaning, about families moving through the darkness of forests we thought we owned. When I got back to Seattle, I started building a database. This was 1980, early days of personal computers, but the Bureau had just started digitizing records. I spent 6 months entering every UBA file into the system. Dates, locations, physical descriptions, behavioral observations. 347 documented incidents since 1962. I wrote a program to analyze the data, looking for patterns the human eye might miss. The results were staggering. I could identify what appeared to be 12 to 15 distinct family groups based on repeated sightings in specific territories, physical descriptions that remained consistent over years, and movement patterns that suggested established home ranges. I was tracking populations, not a mythical creature that randomly appeared and vanished, but actual breeding groups with territories, seasonal behaviors, and social structures. I wrote a 40-page report and presented it to Webb and our special agent in charge, a man named Morrison who'd been with the Bureau since the Hoover days. They read it in silence. Morrison closed the folder and looked at me with eyes that held no surprise whatsoever. "Good work, Agent Callahan," he said. "Keep it in the basement." That was it. No follow-up investigation, no expanded resources, no acknowledgement of what this meant, Just keep filing reports and stay quiet. In January of 1982, I was invited to a meeting I hadn't known existed. A conference room in the Federal Building. No windows, no name on the door. Representatives from the FBI, National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and two men in dark suits who never identified which agency they worked for, though their bearings suggested military or intelligence. The meeting wasn't about investigation. It was about management. How to handle witnesses who wouldn't stay quiet. How to redirect media inquiries. How to ensure physical evidence never reached universities or research institutions. Protocol for containment. I raised my hand like I was back in academy. Why are we hiding this? If they exist, if we have proof, why not acknowledge it? The older of the two unidentified men looked at me like I'd asked why water was wet. Because the moment we acknowledge they exist, Agent Callahan, they have rights. Protected species status, habitat preservation requirements. And that creates complications for timber operations, development projects, military training grounds. Do you understand the economic impact of declaring a new primate species across several million acres of commercial forest? I understood we weren't protecting national security. We were protecting profit margins. That night, I went back to the basement archive and found a file I'd missed before, tucked in the back of the bottom drawer. Inside were photographs, not blurry or unclear like most of the evidence. These were crisp, detailed images from what looked like military-grade game cameras. Thermal imaging showing heat signatures of bipedal figures, 8 to 9 feet tall, moving through forest in groups of 3 to 5. Trail camera photos showing faces, bodies, hands with opposable thumbs. All classified, all buried, all proof that we knew exactly what they were, and we'd decided they weren't worth protecting. The call came in March of 1987, just after 6 in the morning. My home phone, not my office line. A male voice, careful and controlled. "Agent Callahan, you handle the UBA files?" I sat up in bed, instantly awake. "Who is this?" "That doesn't matter. I'm a forest ranger. I've been feeding one for 3 years. They're in danger. Poachers are moving into the area. Someone at the FB, I needs to know they're real and they need protection." "Where are you calling from?" I asked, reaching for the notepad I kept on my nightstand. "Gifford Pinchot. That's all you need to know. Just watch the area, please." The line went dead. I tried calling back, but the number showed up as a payphone. I checked the ranger stations in Gifford Pinchot National Forest, made some calls under the pretense of coordinating on a different case. No one admitted to calling me, but I could hear something in their voices. They knew more than they were saying. I started making regular trips down there, 2 or 3 times a month. Portland was only an hour south, and I could always justify the drive as field work. I coordinated with local rangers, asked about unusual sightings, kept my ear to the ground. One ranger, a young guy named Thomas McKenna, always seemed nervous when I asked questions. He'd answer professionally, show me reports, but his eyes told me he was holding something back. I didn't push. If he was the one protecting them, I didn't want to compromise that. It was October of 1989 when I finally saw one myself. Not tracks, not sounds in the darkness. An actual, direct visual sighting that left no room for doubt. I'd parked my vehicle on a service road just after dawn. Heavy fog had rolled in overnight, turning the forest into something from another world. Visibility maybe 50 yards at best. I was walking a trail I'd hiked a dozen times, carrying a backpack with apples and smoked salmon. I'd started leaving food at certain spots, checking back to see if it had been taken. It always was. I came around a bend where the trail crossed a small creek, and there it was. standing at the tree line, 60 yards away, partially visible through the fog. 8 feet tall, easily. Dark brown hair covering its entire body, longer around the shoulders and head. Massive chest rising and falling with steady breaths. And it was watching me. I froze. Every training exercise I'd ever done, every dangerous situation I'd encountered as an agent, none of it prepared me for this moment. This wasn't a suspect or a threat. This was something that shouldn't exist according to everything I'd been taught. Standing right there in front of me. We looked at each other for what felt like an eternity but was probably 3 minutes. I could see its face clearly despite the fog. Broad, flat nose, heavy brow ridge, eyes that weren't animal eyes. They were thinking, evaluating, deciding. It was assessing whether I was dangerous. I didn't reach for my weapon, didn't move, except to breathe. Just stood there, hands visible at my sides, trying to communicate through stillness that I wasn't a threat. The creature shifted its weight, and I noticed how gracefully it moved despite its size. Not clumsy or brutish, controlled and purposeful. It took 1 step forward, then stopped, testing me. I stayed still. After another long moment, it turned and walked back into the forest. Not running, not crashing through the undergrowth, just walking, like it had made a decision and was moving on. I heard its footsteps fade into the fog, and then it was gone. I stood there shaking for 10 minutes before I could move. When I got back to my car, I wrote everything in my field notebook. Time, location, physical description, behavior observations. Then I added something I'd never written in an official report before. Subject displayed intelligent threat assessment behavior. This is not an animal. This is a thinking being. With Webb's quiet approval, I started a long-term observation project. I set up a feeding station at a specific location, a flat rock near the creek where that first sighting had occurred. Every week, I'd leave food there. Apples, vegetables, fish, sometimes beef jerky. Within 24 hours, it was always gone. I installed a motion-activated camera, hidden in the brush at a distance, the kind of equipment we used for surveillance operations. Over the next 18 months, that camera captured images that would have rewritten biology textbooks if anyone outside the Bureau had seen them. An adult male, probably the same one I'd seen in the fog. An adult female, slightly smaller, with reddish-brown hair, and a juvenile, maybe 4 feet tall, staying close to the adults. A family unit. I watched them through hundreds of photographs. The adults teaching the young one which plants were safe to eat. The male catching fish from the stream and sharing them. The female grooming the juvenile's hair, removing twigs and debris. Communication through gestures and soft vocalizations the camera's audio picked up. They were parenting. Not just surviving, but raising their child with care and attention. By the spring of 1995, they'd become comfortable with my presence. I'd sit on a log maybe 30 yards from the feeding rock, and they'd come to collect the food while I watched. The adults always positioned themselves between me and the juvenile. Protective, but not aggressive. One morning in April, the adult male did something that changed everything. He approached closer than ever before. 20 feet, then 15. Close enough that I could see the individual hairs on his chest, the way his hands had fingernails instead of claws, the old scars on his left side that looked like they'd come from something terrible. We made eye contact, and I saw something in his eyes that made my throat tight. Not just intelligence, emotion, fear maybe, weariness, the weight of experience. He was evaluating me at a level that went beyond instinct. He was making a conscious choice about whether to trust me. He picked up the apples I'd left, held them for a moment, then made a soft sound. Not threatening, almost gentle, like gratitude. Then he turned and walked back to his family. I wrote in my report that night, "Subject demonstrates cognitive abilities consistent with higher primates, shows capacity for trust building and reciprocal social interaction. Family structure suggests complex social bonds and learned behavior transmission between generations." When Webb retired later that year, he called me into his office for a final conversation. He looked old suddenly, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I started this program in 1962, he said. "I hoped we'd find a way to protect them. Instead, I spent 33 years documenting their decline. There are maybe 200 left in the entire Pacific Northwest. Probably fewer. Don't let it end on your watch, Bob. Don't just take notes while they disappear." I promised him I wouldn't. But I had no idea how hard that promise would be to keep. In 1998, the Bureau started digitizing older records, files from before the UBA protocol officially began. I volunteered to help with the project, which gave me access to archives I'd never seen before. Storage boxes from the 1920s through the 1950s, dusty and forgotten in a warehouse facility outside Tacoma. What I found in those boxes made me physically sick. Reports from the 1930s and 40s describing organized hunts, not by random individuals but by government-sanctioned groups. Timber companies clearing land for logging would report encounters with Bigfoot families. Instead of documenting and protecting them, officials would bring in hunting parties. The reports were clinical, detached, subject eliminated, territory cleared for development. No mention that subjects meant living beings with families. There were photographs. Men in old-style hunting gear, grinning as they stood over bodies covered with tarps. Newspaper clippings from small-town papers that ran headlines about wild man bounties and monster hunts. Some articles mentioned specimens being taken to universities or government facilities for study. But when I tried to track down those specimens, the trail went cold every time. Disappeared, lost, no records available. I found correspondence between the Forest Service and the Bureau of Indian Affairs from the 1920s. Native communities had filed complaints about the systematic killing of what they called the forest people. Their letters described families being hunted, territories being destroyed, a deliberate campaign to eliminate them. The government responses were brief, matter resolved, no further action required. They'd been killing them for decades before the UBA protocol even existed. The protocol wasn't created to study them or protect them. It was created to document what was left and make sure nobody found out what we'd done. I spent 3 months going through those old files, and the pattern was clear. Westward expansion, timber operations, military training grounds, highway construction. Anywhere humans wanted to develop, Bigfoot families were in the way, and they were removed. Sometimes killed outright, sometimes driven from their territories into smaller and smaller pockets of wilderness. A slow genocide that nobody acknowledged because officially they didn't exist. In the fall of 2000, I decided to revisit the Patterson-Gimlin incident. Everyone knows about the film from October 1967, the most famous Bigfoot footage ever recorded. But there was another file from 3 weeks later, buried deep in the archives. I'd seen references to it before, but never read the full report. What I found made everything else make sense. 3 weeks after that famous film, hunters in the same area near Bluff Creek, California, shot and killed a female Bigfoot. The local sheriff didn't know what to do, so he called the FBI. Our agents responded along with military personnel. The report included autopsy photographs I had to force myself to look at. She'd been pregnant. The autopsy showed a fetus, maybe 7 months developed, perfectly preserved in the photographs. Both mother and fetus showed old bullet wounds that had healed, surgical scars that suggested previous capture and examination. Someone had caught her before, studied her, then released her, or she'd escaped. The medical examiner's report was detailed. Species shows evidence of long-term persecution. Skeletal analysis reveals healed fractures consistent with trauma from gunshots and traps. Remaining population estimated under 500 individuals based on territory analysis and reproductive rates. Recommend immediate preservation protocols and habitat protection. Stamped across the bottom in red ink, recommendation denied. Below that, a handwritten note. Economic impact assessment indicates forestry and development interests outweigh conservation concerns. Maintain current protocol. Do not pursue. They'd known. They'd known exactly what these creatures were, how few remained, how desperately they needed protection. And they'd decided that logging profits and development rights were more important. I made copies of everything. Technically illegal, but I didn't care anymore. This wasn't about protocol, this was about right and wrong. By 2001, I'd been visiting my feeding station in Gifford Pinchot for over a decade. The family I'd been observing, the male with the scars and his mate and their juvenile, had become part of my life in a way I couldn't explain to anyone. I knew their routines, their favorite foods, the way the young one was learning to fish by watching her parents. It was a Tuesday morning in August when I arrived at the feeding rock and knew immediately something was wrong. The rock was overturned. Branches broken everywhere. Signs of struggle, violent and desperate. I followed the destruction into the trees and found her. The female. She was lying under a pile of branches, partially hidden like someone had tried to cover her body. She'd been shot multiple times. High-powered rifle from the wound patterns. She'd tried to crawl away, leaving a trail of blood through the ferns and moss. But she hadn't made it far. I knelt beside her, my hands shaking. Her eyes were still open, already clouding over. She'd been dead maybe 12 hours. And on her side, in the dried blood, was a small handprint. The juvenile had been here, had tried to help her mother, had touched her one last time. I searched the area for 2 hours. No sign of the male or the juvenile, no bodies, but no tracks leading away either. They'd run or been taken. I didn't know which was worse. I filed a report demanding a full investigation. Homicide, I wrote, because that's what it was. Not a hunting accident, not wildlife management. Murder. I included photographs, measurements, ballistic evidence from the shell casings I found. 3 rounds, 30-06, hunting-grade ammunition. The response came back within 48 hours. Incident outside FBI jurisdiction. Local authorities declined to pursue. Case closed. I drove to the local sheriff's office. They claimed they'd never been contacted about it. No report filed, no evidence logged. Someone higher up had made sure it disappeared. That's when I started pulling files from every FBI field office that had UBA cases. Portland, San Francisco, Boise, Denver, Anchorage. The pattern was everywhere. Initial documentation, evidence of families, then reports of killings, then silence. Not because the creatures left, because there were none left to report. Every office showed the same trajectory: population decline, habitat loss, and systematic elimination. And every office had the same directive: document but do not intervene, maintain secrecy, protect economic interests. I found incident reports from Alaska describing entire family groups wiped out near proposed oil pipeline routes. Files from Northern California showing captures for alleged research that led to subjects dying in captivity. Reports from Oregon about families displaced by highway construction, driven into territories too small to support them, starving. The government hadn't just known about them. We'd been actively involved in their destruction while pretending they didn't exist. because acknowledging them would require protecting them. Protecting them would require habitat preservation, restrictions on logging and development, potentially criminal charges for the people who'd been killing them for decades. It was easier to let them disappear, easier to bury the evidence and maintain the convenient fiction that they were just myths, just stories, just misidentified bears. I sat in my office that night surrounded by copied files and photographs of bodies and autopsy reports, and I understood what Webb had meant. We hadn't been documenting their existence, we'd been documenting their extinction, and I'd been part of it for over 20 years. I was transferred to supervise the Portland field office in 2008, a promotion that should have felt like recognition, but mostly felt like distance from the work that mattered. I was 58 years old, thinking about retirement, thinking about what I'd leave behind, but I couldn't let go. I used vacation days and weekends to drive into the national forests, checking old sites, looking for signs they were still out there. That fall, during a solo patrol in a remote section of Mount Hood National Forest, I found tracks near a stream I'd never surveyed before. Fresh prints, less than 6 hours old based on the moisture content and the way the edges held their shape. Adult-sized, 17 inches, and beside them, smaller prints. 2 juveniles, different sizes. A family. A new family I'd never documented. Over the next 4 years, I dedicated myself to them the way I had with the Gifford Pinchot group. Every week I could manage, I'd make the drive, leave food at a clearing near an old-growth cedar grove, watch from a distance with binoculars and my camera, document their movements, their behaviors, their territory. The adult male showed himself first, cautious but curious. He'd collect the food and retreat, always watching me. By the second year, he'd approach while I was still there, keeping maybe 40 yards between us. I could see he had scars, deep ones running across his left side and torso. Old bullet wounds, partially hidden by his dark hair, but visible when he moved certain ways. In the third year, he brought the family closer. His mate, lighter colored with reddish-brown hair. 2 juveniles, maybe 5 and 7 years old, staying behind their parents but watching everything with wide, intelligent eyes. One morning, in June of 2011, the male did something remarkable. He came within 20 feet, closer than any Bigfoot had ever approached me willingly. He turned his side toward me, showing me those scars deliberately. Then he started communicating using gestures and movements. He pointed to himself, then held his hand low to the ground. Young. He'd been young when it happened. He gestured broadly around us, showing the forest, then made walking motions with his fingers. His family had lived somewhere else before this. He crouched down, making himself small, hiding. Then he formed his hands into the shape of a gun, pointing it, the universal symbol of violence. My chest tightened. Hunters had found his first family. He continued the story without words. Showed me running, showed me falling, touched those scars on his side. He'd been shot, wounded, left for dead maybe. He gestured, showing others, his family, not surviving. He stood there in front of me, this massive being who could have torn me apart without effort, showing me his trauma, trusting me with his pain. "You lost them," I said quietly. "Your first family. And you survived." He made a sound, low and mournful, that I'd never heard before. Then he gestured to his current mate and the juveniles. A new family, a second chance. But the fear remained. The scars remained. I understood then why he'd shown himself to me, why he'd gradually brought his family closer. He was asking for help, or maybe warning me, telling me that humans had done this before and could do it again. That understanding became urgent 3 months later when I learned about a proposed development project. a luxury resort and golf course planned for an area adjacent to their territory. I reviewed the environmental impact statements, all the required documentation. No mention of unusual wildlife, despite the fact that I had years of photographic evidence proving a Bigfoot family lived there. I faced an impossible choice. If I submitted my evidence officially, the Bureau would bury it like they always did. The development would proceed, the family would lose their territory, and I'd probably lose my job for breaking protocol. If I went public, gave my evidence to the media or scientists, the family would become targets. Trophy hunters, researchers wanting to capture them, sensation seekers flooding the forest. Either way, they'd be destroyed. I made a decision that probably crossed ethical lines, but felt like the only option. I used FBI resources to document spotted owl populations in the development zone. The owls were there, just hadn't been included in the developers' surveys. I made sure they were included in new assessments. Endangered species protections kicked in, delaying the project indefinitely. At the same time, I started a covert operation. Anytime hunters came near the family's territory, I'd find reasons to have state wildlife officers in the area. Anonymous tips about poaching activity, reports of trespassing, suspicious vehicles. I created an invisible, protective barrier using law enforcement presence without ever revealing why. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't sustainable, but it bought them time and space. I coordinated with trusted rangers who suspected but didn't ask questions. We rotated patrols, maintained pressure on anyone who didn't belong in that sector. I falsified some incident reports, exaggerated others, did whatever it took to keep people away from that cedar grove in the surrounding territory. The male seemed to understand what I was doing. In our final meeting, 1 year before my retirement in 2012, he approached me one last time. The juveniles had grown, almost adult size now. His mate stayed close, protective but calm. He walked up to a cedar tree and placed his massive hand on the trunk. Then he placed his hand on his own chest. The gesture I'd seen in ranger reports from other witnesses. The gesture that meant home, identity, self. He was thanking me, acknowledging what I'd tried to do. I mirrored the gesture. Hand on tree, hand on my heart. Then I did something I'd never done before. I placed my hand over my badge, then gestured to him and his family. A promise, protection, as long as I could provide it. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached out, and for just a second, his enormous hand rested gently on my shoulder. The weight of it, the warmth of it through my jacket. A gesture of trust that transcended species. His family melted back into the forest. I watched them go, knowing it might be the last time. I was retiring in 8 months. What happened after that was beyond my control. I drove back to Portland that evening thinking about Webb's words from 17 years earlier. Don't let it end on your watch. I'd done everything I could, used every tool available, bent every rule, crossed lines I'd never thought I'd cross. But one person can only do so much, and the forces working against them, the development, the habitat destruction, the willful ignorance, the economic interests that outweighed their right to exist, those forces were so much larger than me. I'd saved one family, maybe, for now, but how many others were out there, unprotected, unknown, disappearing in silence while the world pretended they'd never existed at all? That question haunted me then. It haunts me still. I retired from the FB HOMI in June of 2013 after 35 years of service. There was a ceremony, handshakes from people who had no idea what I'd really spent my career doing. They gave me a plaque and a gold watch and thanked me for my dedication to justice. Nobody mentioned the UBA files. Nobody asked about the hundreds of cases I'd managed in secret, the evidence I'd buried, the families I'd tried to protect while the system worked against me. I moved to a small cabin outside Bellingham, Washington. Close enough to the forests, close enough to keep watching. Because I couldn't stop. Even in retirement, I monitored online forums where people reported sightings. I maintained contact with a network of rangers and field agents who shared my concerns, people who'd seen things they couldn't explain and couldn't officially report. The numbers I was seeing terrified me. Based on reports and my own population modeling, I estimated fewer than 150 individuals remained across the entire Pacific Northwest. Maybe fewer. The decline was accelerating. Habitat loss from development, forest fires intensified by climate change, genetic bottlenecking from isolated populations that couldn't interbreed, and still, occasionally, killings. Hunters who shot first and stayed quiet, or bodies that disappeared before anyone could document them. Before I left the Bureau, I did something that could have sent me to prison. I made copies of classified documents. Decades of evidence stored in waterproof containers in my cabin. Photographs, autopsy reports, population assessments, incident reports showing continuous government knowledge and systematic inaction. Proof that we'd known about them since at least 1962, probably longer, and had chosen secrecy over protection. I spent months debating what to do with that evidence. I considered sending it to journalists, scientists, conservation organizations, but every scenario I played out ended the same way. The evidence would be dismissed as fabricated, or the government would discredit me as a conspiracy theorist having a mental breakdown. They'd perfected that strategy over decades. And even if people believed it, what would happen? The last remaining families would become targets for every trophy hunter and thrill seeker in the country. Museums and research facilities would want specimens. The creatures would be captured, studied, put in cages, or killed trying to escape. Sometimes protecting them meant keeping silent. That was the impossible truth I'd learned. The same silence that had enabled their decline was now the only thing keeping the survivors alive. In the fall of 2019, I got a phone call that brought everything full circle. A young woman, 32 years old, FBI agent stationed in Seattle. She'd found the UBA files during a routine archive search. She had questions. She wanted answers. Her name was Sarah Chen. We met at a coffee shop in Bellingham, neutral territory where we could talk without being overheard. She reminded me of myself 40 years earlier. Smart, idealistic, disturbed by what she'd discovered. "I've been reading through the files," she said, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup like she needed the warmth. "There are thousands of reports, decades of documentation. Why isn't anyone doing anything?" I told her everything, the history, the pattern, the systematic cover-up, the families I'd known, the ones I'd watched die, the impossible choices I'd faced. When I finished, she looked at me with a mixture of horror and determination. "We have to expose this," she said. "We have evidence. We can go to the press, to Congress, to conservation groups." I shook my head. I spent 35 years trying to work within the system. It's designed to resist this truth. Going public might get you fired, discredited, investigated for mishandling classified materials, and worse, it might get the last families killed. Trophy hunters, black market collectors, governments wanting to capture them for study. The moment they're confirmed to exist, they stop being safe. She stared at me like I'd given up. Maybe I had. What do we do then? Just watch them go extinct? "We protect the ones we can," I said. Quietly. The way I did with the Mount Hood family. The way rangers like Thomas McKenna have been doing for decades. We maintain the silence that keeps them hidden, and we do everything possible to preserve their habitat without revealing why. "It's not enough," she said. I know, but it's all we have. She left that meeting frustrated, angry with me for not being the ally she'd hoped for. I understood. I'd felt that same frustration for 4 decades. The rage at a system that prioritized everything except the truth. The helplessness of knowing and being unable to act. But a year later, she called me again. She'd started her own quiet campaign, monitoring territories, coordinating with sympathetic rangers, using her position to delay development projects near known habitats. She'd become what I'd been, a guardian working in shadows. I still leave food at certain locations in the forests, remote spots where I've seen signs, heard vocalizations, found tracks that appear and vanish like ghosts. Sometimes the food is gone by morning. Sometimes I find prints nearby, arrangements of stones or sticks that seem too deliberate to be random. I can't confirm if it's the Mount Hood family or others. Can't say for certain they're still out there, but I choose to believe they are. Because the alternative, that I documented their final years and did nothing to prevent their extinction, is unbearable. I'm 78 years old now. I have heart problems, arthritis, all the things that come with age. I won't be around much longer. And when I die, this knowledge might die with me unless someone continues the work. That's why I'm breaking my silence now. Not with the classified documents, those stay hidden, but with my testimony, my story, my 40 years of witnessing something the world refuses to acknowledge. They existed. They still exist. Somewhere in the deep forests where satellites don't reach and hikers don't wander. Family groups trying to survive in a world that's been trying to erase them for over a century. They're not monsters. They're not myths. They're intelligent beings with families, emotions, complex social structures. They feel fear and loss and love the same way we do, and they deserve better than government files and classified reports. They deserve better than being hunted to extinction while officials pretend they never existed. They deserve to live without fear, to raise their children, to exist in the forests that were theirs long before they were ours. I kept my silence for 40 years because I thought it would protect them. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But I'm old now, and someone needs to remember they were here. Someone needs to carry forward the truth that they were real, that they mattered, that their extinction would be a loss we can never recover from. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm not providing the proof that would convince skeptics, because that proof, in the wrong hands, would be a death sentence for the families that remain. I'm just asking this. If you're ever in the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest, and you see something that doesn't fit, something that watches you with intelligent eyes and then vanishes into the shadows, let it go. Don't follow, don't photograph, don't report. Just remember that you witnessed something precious and rare, and give it the gift of your silence. Because silence, for all its failures, might be the last protection they have.